From Penn State University, this is Pennsylvania Inside Out, connecting communities to a world of creativity and knowledge. Here's tonight's host, Patty Satalia.
Welcome to Pennsylvania Inside Out. From 1951 until 1974, hundreds of Philadelphia prisoners were used as human guinea pigs in an array of unethical and oftentimes dangerous medical experiments. The experiments left many test subjects, most of whom were African Americans, in excruciating pain and with long-term health problems. Our guests are Alan Hornblum, author of Sentenced to Science, One Black Man's Story of Imprisonment in America. He's the first person to shine a light on this dark chapter in American medical history. Also with us is Eddie Anthony, now known as Yusef Anthony. His story is the focus of Hornblum's book, which is published by Penn State Press. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Good to be with you, Patty.
Well, how did you first learn that Holmesburg prison inmates were being used as test subjects?
Well, I witnessed it. I was actually just out of graduate school, and I decided in the early 70s that I wanted to do some positive work for society rather than completing my graduate education. So I started working in the Philadelphia prisons, and it was on my initial tours through the complex of prisons in Philly that I saw scores of men wearing adhesive tape and bandages and all sorts of wraps around their heads and backs and arms, and I couldn't imagine the prison was that safe. You know, were these, knife fights on a cell block or a gang war in the prison yard? And the next day I asked the guard on the cell block, what's with all these guys who were strapped in wrap and adhesive tape and bandages? He says, oh, that's nothing, that's just the perfume test for the University of Pennsylvania. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, they're doing perfume experiments. And it was so ridiculous to see these men who were, in many cases, killers and rapists and burglars and robbers, testing perfume. I couldn't imagine it. But in fact, what I had learned was that experiments had been going on, medical experiments, serious invasive procedures, for 20 years before I ever got there.
And not just cosmetics and perfumes.
Absolutely. I thought that was in the minority if there was any perfume. They were doing just anything you can imagine, from the innocuous to the truly dangerous.
Now, was this an anomaly in Holmesburg prison, or is this something that's gone on in other prisons across the country?
It was widespread in the Cold War years in America. From the end of the Second World War to the mid-70s, at least half the states had one prison that were hosting prison medical experiments. Pennsylvania, unfortunately, led the way with at least 10 prisons that were doing this. And it was quite common during those post-war years where institutionalized populations were being used as human guinea pigs by the medical community.
Your book really is an indictment of the Philadelphia prison system and the medical community. How did the two come to work together?
Well, it was obviously a marriage of convenience. There were folks in the pharmaceutical community and the medical community who wanted to do clinical trials. The University of Pennsylvania is a big research operation, so it was convenient to them and everybody if they could find cheap and available test subjects, and that's what the prison system afforded them. The inmates themselves were desperate to make money, not particularly well educated, so they naturally gravitated to a test where they could make far more money being a guinea pig than they could pushing a broom on a cell block.
Was it money that lured you to do your first test?
Yes, it was money, and the fact that I didn't have people coming up to visit me at the time to put money on the books for me so I could go to the commissary at the store. And also they was using it to get bail money if you had low bail. You could possibly get out on bail by participating in the tests, That's basically what lured me, you know what I mean?
Tell us about your first test.
They signed me to a Johnson & Johnson bubble bath test. And I went over there, and if you ever seen the cover of Acres of Skin, they have a guy sitting on the table with patches on his back. Well, they put 6 patches on my back of bubble bath. But it was a solution they sprayed on my back to seal the pores on my back so that the tape would stick on, so that my back wouldn't sweat, and it was very toxic. That got into my bloodstream, and it poisoned me, and I'm still suffering from that particular test right now today. My hands and stuff broke out, my feet.
If we get a shot of your fingernails, we can see that your fingernails are rougher than normal fingernails.
And they were a half-inch thick.
And these look good now. These look good now compared to the way they were when I was incarcerated and through the years. They was like, my one finger was the size of 2 fingers. And my fingernails was growing like claws. And in fact, before my hands and feet broke out, my whole body was inflamed after the poison got into my system. It was benzoids and isotopes in the chemicals in the can. And I was sensitive to it.
Is it likely that he really wasn't testing bubble bath?
Probably was not, but we don't know for sure. These men were actually treated like guinea pigs. They weren't told exactly what it was. In many cases, they were deceived. I haven't found anybody who knew that they were being injected with radioactive isotopes or were told they were being involved in a test with Dow Chemical where dioxin was being placed on their faces and backs. So in many cases, just like you would not tell a guinea pig, this is what I'm going to do to you today, they did this with human beings in the prison system.
And it wasn't just the University of Pennsylvania Medical School involved in this. It was also the Army and the CIA. There was military testing going on as well.
If you were in the business of testing products or wanting to put a product on the market, you knew about Dr. Kligman, University of Pennsylvania, and Holmesburg Prison. They were infamous, notorious in the field of human experimentation. So you had Dow Chemical in Michigan coming to Philadelphia. You had R.J. Reynolds in North Carolina for tobacco cancer tests coming to Philadelphia. You had the Army in Edgewood Arsenal, Maryland coming to Philadelphia because they knew that was a site where you could get anything tested on people.
So those are the contractors who are
correct.
paying. You're making a little bit of money. The prison's making a fair amount of money.
They're making more, and the doctors and the major proprietors, you know, the chemical companies, pharmaceutical companies, are making the big bucks.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago Mr. Hornblum's first book, Acres of Skin, Human Experiments at Holmesburg Prison, a true story of abuse and exploitation in the name of medical science. When that book came out, you and others in the Philadelphia community, I think, were astounded to read that this was your story out there.
That's right. And we thought that we didn't have a case or a way to go, you know, get recompense for what we went through. But after the book came out, we decided to come up with a class action lawsuit because we found that it's a law called the rule of discovery. We thought we had signed away our rights when we were incarcerated, and we found out that the papers that they used was illegal. But when the book came out, it pointed, you know, to the direction that they had misused us. So we came up with the class action lawsuit, but we never got through the courts. You know what I mean?
Well, you bring up an interesting point. One of the hallmarks of the Nuremberg medical trials from 1933 to 1945, Nazi doctors used concentration camps in much the way as the Holmesburg prisons were used, was a code of ethics. And one of the codes is informed consent.
First principle.
Explain what that is, and then I want to talk to you about what you thought you were getting.
Well, one of the very sad chapters of American medical history in the 20th century is that we tried the Nazi doctors. We harangued them. We told them what proper research medicine is like. We executed 7 of them. Then we write this excellent code of 10 principles, but we never bought into it ourselves. It was remarkable. We told other countries how to do it. Many of them bought into it, but we ourselves moved into the Gilded Age of research in the 1950s, where we were using retarded subjects, we were using the emotionally disturbed, we were using pregnant women, all sorts of people who were institutionalized were grist for the research mill, and that was very sad. With regard to that first principle, it also goes into the fact that the test subjects should not be in a confined or coercive environment, which is particularly poignant to the story of Acres of Skin and Sentenced to Science. Our history of using prison inmates is a pretty bleak one, and unfortunately the government is actually thinking of returning to it again. So it's something that Yusef and I are very much opposed to.
What did you think you were getting into?
Well, they coerced you to believe that the tests were safe, you know, and you know you weren't taking a chance or anything. But when you go over there, they gave you a simple piece of paper that read like, if something was to happen to you after the test, you can't hold the University of Pennsylvania responsible. So right there, you would automatically question it. I thought they were safe. They tell you this is just a formality. Just, you know, you just have to have your signature to make it believe that it was, you know, everything was all right. But after they got you over there, and if you got sick, they didn't have no aftercare in place or nothing, you know. Like this happened to me in 1964, and here it is, 2007. I'm still suffering from that, you know.
I want to get back to that in just a moment. This is Pennsylvania Inside Out on WPSU. I'm Patty Satalia. In his new book, Sentenced to Science, author Alan Hornblum tells the disturbing story of Eddie Anthony's days as a Holmesburg prison test subject. The book is a searing indictment of the criminal justice and medical communities that disdainfully used Philadelphia inmates as human guinea pigs in an array of unethical and questionable experiments. Our guests are author Alan Hornblum and former test subject Eddie, now Yusef Anthony. Despite the experience of your first test, and I have to say that your inmates, your cellmates, were fortunate enough to undergo more innocuous tests, you signed up to do more because the need for money in prison is a strong one.
And prison being such a dangerous place. You know, you had the test offered you a thing of being independent, where you didn't have to depend on friends or other inmates, and it was a corrupt environment. So if you had money on the books, you know, this put a little safety on your stay in incarceration. So, you know, like after the money runs out, which was a little bit of money for each test.
Give us an idea of what you might get paid.
Well, the first test I was on, in which I'm still suffering from today, this was 1964, I got something like $30-something. You know, I didn't have to participate in the whole test because of the fact I broke out so bad about the first week. And they told me, well, you don't have to do the rest of the test. And we're going to pay you the whole amount. And the whole amount was $30-something for a 21-day, having patches put on my back every day with big blisters breaking out on me. And then eventually my whole body broke out as if I had German measles.
And people didn't recognize you. In fact, they steered away from you when you went to the mess hall.
When I went to the mess hall, they refused to sit down beside me, afraid it was contagious. They would get something, so they had to feed me on the blocks. You know what I mean? This is how bad it was. And then after you get out of jail, they got me controlled. Then when I got out, it broke out again in the street. I had nowhere to go to. They had no aftercare in place for, you know, that you could go for refuge or for treatment. So I wound up going to the PGH, and when I did finally get there,
PGH?
It was the Philadelphia General Hospital. And it's no longer in existence, but my hands and feet, the stuff that was in my whole body came down to my hands and feet. My hands were big as 8-ounce boxing gloves. I wear a 10.5 shoe. I couldn't get my foot in a 14 AAA when they took me in there. And they had me hospitalized for a whole month. And I had to be treated twice for this. Here lately, I haven't got no positive diagnosis of what I got wrong with me. It's something in my blood. I break out every time the weather gets warm. I break out again. You know, they give me a little salve to bring it under control, but I never get rid of it.
You know, in addition to the physical and emotional trauma of having gone through this, the African-American community seems to be distrustful of the American medical system in general, not because just this, but also because of Tuskegee, the syphilis experiments, and other things. Talk a little bit about that.
The African-American community is very reluctant to deal with doctors in the medical community. They have very low rates of participation in contributions on body parts and transplants and visiting doctors and what have you. And it's not just the Tuskegee syphilis study, which is probably the most infamous case of unethical medicine, but all of these other cases that are out there that maybe haven't, you know, digested in the American Caucasian mind. But for example, in Philadelphia, unfortunately, there are so many African Americans who have had relatives who went through Holmesburg for that quarter century. They have heard from fathers or grandfathers or brothers what happened, and you know, the circle of friends that Eddie and all the other thousands were used in. They really become legitimately distrustful of the American medical community.
Explain, if you would, the experiments were conducted, quote, under the direction of University of Pennsylvania dermatologist Albert Kligman is someone you mentioned in your book. What exactly did under the direction of mean?
Well, it meant that it was basically his operation. He walks into Holmesburg prison back in 1951, ostensibly to help out with another outbreak of ringworm in athlete's foot. But he's a very bright, creative guy. And right away, you know, he recognized the potential for research medicine. He sees an institution with 1,200 people, and as he thought to himself and said many times over and over, there were acres of skin in there that you could use for medical experimentation. So he meets with the superintendent of the prison subsequent to that, and he says, I think I can help you out, maybe you can help me. And over a handshake, they develop a system that runs for a quarter century where the inmates are basically farmed out to the University of Pennsylvania, and this doctor who will coordinate all of these experiments. Initially, I think they were rudimentary academic studies, but then you have the pharmaceutical companies coming, looking to do phase 1 tests on some innocuous things as well as some very dangerous things. Then you have the Army, the CIA, you have R.J. Reynolds, you have Dow. Everybody knows about Philadelphia, and these inmates become part of sort of contract labor that we had in the last part of the 19th century in the Deep South is happening in the North, with prison systems being turned over to doctors in the medical community.
Did some tests pay better, and were there red flags that this one pays better, it's probably also more dangerous?
Exactly. The tests that the Army bought in the Pentagon, they built trailers in between the blocks with padded cells in them. And they start experiment with warfare agent chemicals. The first test on LSD was done on the inmates in there. They put them in padded cells, and you got a long list of people suffering from mental problems right now in the day, going back to when I was in there in 1964. They go on and being treated at Warren A. Smith's Drug and Alcohol Mental Retardation Center for paranoid, schizophrenic, and things like that. They're from the government's tests.
People who became, as you described them, like zombies.
Yeah, they were using all sorts of psychotropic drugs in very high levels of atropine, scopolamine, benzolates, belladonnoids. The Army at that time in the 60s was looking for something that would create the Manchurian candidate, quite frankly, as well as to incapacitate the enemy. And they had initially been using these things on soldiers at Edgewood Arsenal, but it was laying these men out for an extended period of time. They needed another test site. They knew to come to Philly because we had already achieved that reputation with Kligman, Holmesburg, and University of Pennsylvania.
Now, for his part, according to your book, Kligman, who was recognized by a prestigious medical society for his achievements in his field, issued a statement saying that his research, quote, was in keeping with this nation's standard protocol for conducting scientific investigations at the time.
That's a pretty sad commentary, but there may be some truth to it because, as I said, anybody who was in a vulnerable position in an institution could be used as a test subject. There was not the concern back in those days. There was everybody, trusted the medical community and doctors, and they were able to, take advantage of the situation. And it's not one of the facts that we should be particularly proud of. I think Holmesburg is actually worse than just about any other I can think of because they're doing cancer studies at Ohio State Penitentiary. They're doing testicular transplants in Oregon and Washington State, but they tend to be only for a few years and target one area. Holmesburg was actually a department store of opportunity for researchers. Anything you wanted done, you could come there. For example, the Army and the CIA are doing these psychotropic drug studies. Kligman has no specialty in that. He's a skin doctor, but he's willing to take their money and do the test, and they're willing to use him to get their data. So it was a marriage of convenience, and the test subjects were grist for the mill.
Right.
What recourse, if any, you mentioned a class action suit.
Right. Well, we got some lawyers interested in what we were doing, and they took our case pro bono. But it seemed like as soon as we get to a certain area in the courts, that the lawyers would look like they would sell us out. And I think it was because
the lawyering wasn't the best. I mean, some of these guys, can make the argument first they were screwed by the doctors and then they were screwed by the lawyers. But it's also a problem in Pennsylvania. You have a 2-year window with a statute of limitations from when you knew or should have known you were damaged to file suit. These guys, quite frankly, didn't know until Acres of Skin comes out in '98 exactly what they were being exposed to. And when they first started coming to the meetings in that summer and they're reading the book, they recognized the experiments but had no idea that they were testing these things because they had never been told the truth.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there's this human experimentation in prison is currently a pretty hot topic of debate, and in fact there's a number of influential medical experts who are petitioning the federal government to loosen the regulations that were established back in the 70s. In addition to that, there's legislation introduced in Missouri and South Carolina that has offered prisoners reduced sentences if they donate an organ. I'm wondering what you make of that.
It's the latter part that you bring up is a very utilitarian deal that's being made. They see some folks who need body parts. It could be a kidney, it could be a lung, it could be bone marrow, and then we have over 2 million people in prison doing time. Why not use those imprisoned people as a farm body, you know, a factory of body parts? So in Missouri, I think they were going to offer a reduced sentence if you were sentenced to death. Now you would get life in prison if you gave up a body part. In South Carolina, I think the legislation they introduced, you would get a half year off your sentence if you gave up a body part. So these are people in the legislative arena who see a need and see all these people, throwaway people, you know, for the most part, but it's a very slippery slope to move into that arena.
I want to end with this because I think few doctors would dispute that testing drugs on people is necessary. No amount of using lab animals will tell us reliably how certain things will work. That said, is there a way in your mind to use the prison population in medical experimentation in an ethical way? I want to start with you and then end with you.
I believe on paper, theoretically, you can say that and argue that, but in actuality, those prison walls not only keep the inmates in, they keep the public out. It is so easy to take advantage of that situation that I oppose it.
Okay, and I'm sorry I don't have time to follow up on that. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Okay.
Our guests have been Alan Hornblum and former test subject Eddie, now Yusef Anthony. The book is Sentenced to Science. For Pennsylvania Inside Out, I'm Patty Satalia.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.